we're going to have our next speaker. I believe there should be a transition right now. Perfect. Ania Bialic is going to help us answer a question that we probably all had. Do I have worms? And if so, can she help? She is a microbiologist on campus, and you have done a lot of work to communicate about diseases and sometimes how those parasites and diseases can invade our immune systems and how we can learn from that. With that, I'll see you backstage to answer my question.
Oh, I cannot get rid of your worms, Ben. I am not a medical doctor. Hello, everyone. I've already had a great introduction, so I don't need to introduce myself. It saves me like 3 seconds, so I won't get fiddled off. But I'm here to convince you in 10 minutes why we should all really, really care about parasites. And I'm just going to have a really boring slide, first off, just because these are some of the terms I'm going to use. And I'm a really visual learner, so I just wanted to flash them up first and give you quick definitions. So if they are mentioned and you're not familiar with them, you'll understand what's going on. So a parasitologist is someone who studies parasites. Protozoa are microscopic single-celled organisms different than bacteria. Helminths are parasitic worms. You'll hear me say helminthic a couple times, would be a really cool metal band name. Endemic, it means it occurs regularly in an area. CRISPR-Cas9, some people have heard of, but it's a gene editing technology. Lesions or damaged tissue. And finally, antibodies are part of the immune system that recognize foreign material. So I thought I was just going to throw a couple pathogens we might be familiar with to get it kicked off. Does anyone know what the green one is? Say it louder. Yeah, it's a virus. I didn't think I needed to include why we all knew what a virus looked like, but I kind of like that infographic. What is the orange one that kind of looks like algae?
Fungus.
Okay, yes, it's a fungus. After the zeitgeist entering show, Last of Us, this pathogen has really had its time in the limelight. What's the next one? Nice. Yeah, so the last couple of years, gut health has been super, super talked about, which is fantastic. Super important to understand the distinction between happy bacteria, bad bacteria. Happy to see it. But the last one is maybe a little bit neglected. And what do we think it is? Parasites. Okay, so we did actually have a little bit of time in pop culture in 2020, if anyone remembers the fantastic movie Parasite, which to a lot of parasitologists' dismay was actually not about parasites at all. I was super disappointed. So we know parasites matter, and parasites are absolutely everywhere. So in a general definition of parasite, it's an organism that lives on or inside another organism, which we call the host. And it's not a symbiotic relationship. They obtain nutrients from that host at the expense of the host. And I just want to give you a couple numbers to back up the fact that parasites are actually everywhere. So in humans alone, there's at least 300 parasitic worms, helminthic. As I mentioned, I actually put worms, so I should have put helminthic there to do a little recall. And more than 70 protozoan parasites, which are single-celled buddies. There's over 1,000 parasites that infect animals, over 4,000 parasitic plants. Mistletoe is one that some people are regularly familiar with. And over 70,000 parasitoids, which are parasites that infect insects. And you're probably thinking, based on this general definition, it's kind of an umbrella term, that bacteria and viruses and fungi must be parasites too. And you're right. For most parasitologists, what we're referring to, unless you're a veterinary parasitologist, because I don't want to piss any veterinary parasitologists off by saying this, you're probably talking about the human parasite. So I'm a human parasitologist, so that's really what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my talk. And I just want to really highlight that I'm going to be talking about parasites that cause a lot of neglected tropical diseases. And those are diseases that generally affect the global south. And they're not neglected because they don't affect a lot of people. They affect a ton of people, but they are in countries that are resource limited and funding limited. And so I think talks like this are really important to get more people understanding how important these diseases are and who they're affecting. In this map itself, like the red and orange part of the world is higher parasite burden, and the yellow and lighter colors are lower parasite burden. And you can see it's definitely distinctive. You've got the global south with a much more parasite burden. For example, malaria used to be a neglected tropical disease, and it infects over 250 million people a year. Over 600,000 people die a year. And it's endemic in 80 countries. And it's only not neglected because there's been a lot more money and effort being put into treating malaria. And I also want to say that I'm going to anthropomorphize a lot of these parasites, but I know that they cause really terrible diseases, but talking about them as like the mechanisms that they've evolved to work with our immune system, super interesting. And it's a little bit easier to kind of describe it as a superpower, but I want you to know that I know they would not be Superman, they would definitely be a villain. So just gonna say that now before I get into it. So the first superpower of one of our parasites is invisibility cloak on leishmania. Some of you might be familiar with leishmaniasis. It's also a veterinary disease, so it affects dogs. If you adopt a rescue dog from a country with a warmer climate, this is a disease you want to look out for. They test for it when you adopt, but it is something that can reactivate because the superpower for this parasite is it actually hides out in our immune cells, the immune cell being a macrophage. If anyone isn't familiar with a macrophage, that's fine. It's basically the Pac-Man of your immune system. It just chomps up things that you don't want floating around. And fun fact, macrophages eat tattoo ink and they can't digest it, so it just hangs out there. So anyone with tattoos, pertinent knowledge, very important. You learned during a parasitology talk, tell all your friends. Forgot to do the Pac-Man. And leishmaniasis is transmitted by a sandfly. And I'm only putting the life cycle diagram there just to kind of show how complex parasite life cycles are because it's going to be kind of important for our next parasite and its superpower. Who has heard of toxo? Raise your hands. Cool. Who has a cat? Raise your hands. Okay, who has a cat and thinks that they only like cats because of mind control? Raise your hands. Oh, okay, all right, I love it. At least 3 people. Wow, you're breaking out of the mind control, apparently. So this is the mind control parasite. It's kind of made the news a couple times because toxo infects the brain, and they've shown in studies that mice infected with toxo actually want to be around cats. And cats are super important. So here's a boring life cycle diagram. I promised you'd get another one. But just pay attention to the little red box because cats are the super important part of this parasite's life cycle. Cats are the part where toxo needs to sexually reproduce. It can infect any warm-blooded mammal, but it can only reproduce in the cat, which is really unusual. And so a lot of research has been poured into why it can only reproduce in the cat. And a lot of research has been poured into why mice are wanting to be around cats when they're infected with toxo. So that's where the whole mind control thing spun out, which is kind of extended to, oh, maybe people only want cats because we're being controlled by the toxo. I don't know. I think cats are cute. I don't know if I believe that. But if you want, there's a lot of cool or questionable YouTube videos that you can look into after this talk. So I'm going to take a little break from the whole superpower thing and talk a little bit about how parasites can be used medically. So how many people are familiar with the hygiene hypothesis? Okay, cool. So it is basically if you're exposed to germs and microbes when you're younger, you're less likely to develop autoimmune disease. And although a lot of scientists do not agree with the hygiene hypothesis, hence it's a hypothesis, everyone can agree worms are old. We have been growing with a lot of these pathogens we see since long, long ago. And as we live in a sterilized environment now, we're interacting with those pathogens less when we're developing. So a couple scientists were like, hey, maybe we don't believe in the hygiene hypothesis, but we should have worms. And so they infected people with worms, and they wanted to see would it cure any of these diseases. And actually, it reduced inflammation in a lot of things. And so there's active studies where people are infected with worms or given the secretion, it's called the secretome of worms, to see if it affects inflammatory diseases. I have to follow that with a PSA. Please do not self-treat with worms. Do not. I'm saying this now. It's recorded. No one can sue me. We're good. Thank you. Okay. Next. Finally, my absolute favorite superpower of any parasite, the trypanosome. I just want to say trypanosomes cause really awful diseases, African sleeping sickness and Chagas disease, and I'm going to tell you why. So trypanosomes are covered in something called a variable surface glycoprotein. I did not put that on the slide because you do not ever need to remember that again. But you can think of it as a coat. It's a purple coat. And this purple coat tells your immune system something's wrong, and your immune system is going to generate a response. So your immune system's like, okay, we caught you. Generate a great response, we're going to clear you. But what does the trypanosome do? It changes its VST to something entirely different. So your immune system has put in a lot of work, a lot of resource, and now it's going to have to do it again. And can we guess what it does? It changes again, and it does this again and again and again. And there's thousands of combinations of these VSGs. It is super hard for your immune system to respond. It's basically the mystique of parasites. And so I don't want to negate the fact that these diseases are super hard to treat and they're super hard on the people who are infected with them, but there is a bit of a positive side with this parasite specifically, that there is a company in Germany that is utilizing this super unique system. They're genetically modifying with CRISPR, and they're having these parasites express one thing, the small molecule like fentanyl or an antigen from a tumor, and they're able to generate immunomodulatory therapies against these things. So you could possibly vaccinate against a fentanyl overdose. It's super interesting. They're called trypanogen. And I also recommend, you've got worms to look up, you've got toxo, mind control, you've got VSGs, so many things to go home and Google. And that brings me to my final slide. I cannot believe I'm under 10 minutes. This is so exciting. I was shocked that if any of this stuff is super interesting to you, and I have successfully convinced you that we should all care about parasites, there are actually comics produced by my old work available for free online. If you Google WCIP Comics Glasgow, they're available in a ton of languages, and you are very welcome to share them with your friends. And you can go home and be like, wow, I just learned so much about parasitology. Now I want to be a parasitologist. Like, thank God Ania talked to me today. So thank you so much for listening.
Nice job. Take care.